Chapter 5. Things that go bump in the night. The water turned an inky black that night, and Eddie Rickenbacker couldn't sleep. An entire world throbbed beneath the three tiny rafts. At its average, the Pacific Ocean runs 2.5 miles deep. In 1942, the Empire State Building stood as the tallest human-made structure in the world. Clouds sometimes obscured the tip of its spire, and yet almost 9 Empire State Buildings, stacked one atop the other, would fit between the rafts and the bottom of the ocean. There were creatures the size of buses down there. If a curious humpback whale decided to surface in the wrong place, the men would be scattered helpless on the waves. Then, of course, there were the sharks. Rickenbacker felt the first impact shortly after dark. Something swept past from below and bumped the flexible canvas floor of the raft. Then it happened again. A tail or a head broke the surface of the water a few feet away. Then another bump from below. One after another, the sharks that had been following them took turns scraping against the bottom of the rafts. When one hit just right, the men could feel the impact on the backs of their legs. Just a fraction of an inch of rubberized canvas between human flesh and predator. Sometimes the sharks rocked the rafts with a flip of their tails before vanishing again in the dark. It wasn't clear whether they were looking for a meal, but no one wanted to find out. The rafts felt insubstantial next to 1,000 pounds of muscle and teeth. Rickenbacker worried that the rough, scaly hide of a particularly aggressive shark could shred the canvas, leaving nothing between him and a swarm of ravenous killers. And so he lay in the moonlight, wide awake, waiting for the next nudge from below. Sleep would have been a welcome relief from the conditions in the raft. Rickenbacker's bed was barely the size of a bathtub, and he was sharing it with 2 grown men. Colonel Adamson, whose back was in bad shape, lay curled in one end. Rickenbacker and Bartek tossed and turned in the other half, trying to find an alignment they could live with. Every move they made provoked a groan from Adamson. One badly placed elbow, and the groans turned into a foul-mouthed grumbling. But even if Adamson hadn't been there, if the raft had been as big as a bedroom and equipped with a mattress, if the sharks had merely been tropical fish splashing about in the waves, Rickenbacker still would not have slept. They had agreed on a schedule of watch duty. But what if Bartek or Reynolds or DeAngelis dozed off and slept through the hum of a passing plane? What if Sergeant Alex mistook the lights of a ship for a pair of stars on the horizon? It didn't come naturally to Eddie Rickenbacker to leave his fate in someone else's hands. His parents had been dirt poor when they arrived in Columbus, Ohio, from Switzerland. His mother cleaned other people's laundry to pay back a $300 loan for their first house. By the time he was 5, Eddie was hawking newspapers to help support the family. To heat the house, he and his brother scrounged for coal dropped from passing trains. He grew up believing that you survived in this world on your own strength, knowledge, and initiative. A race car driver had his pit crew. A pilot had expert mechanics. But when it came down to it, there was just the driver, the car, and the road, the pilot, the plane, and the sky. Eddie Rickenbacker was convinced of one thing above all others. There was only one person he could rely on, and that was Eddie Rickenbacker. Finally, dawn came, and the world began to lighten. A gray mist hung over the rafts as the air began to warm. They had been shivering all night in the cold salt spray, but now their bodies slowly began to heat up. The sharks, however, were still with them, circling like vultures. Shouting across the swells, the men tried to figure out whether their stalkers saw them as prey or just a curiosity. The U.S. Army taught its flyers that sharks aren't a danger to humans. But maybe the generals were just trying to calm their nerves. After all, the newspapers had a habit of referring to the Pacific as shark-infested waters. In early August, Japanese ships had sunk 3 American cruisers and a destroyer off Guadalcanal. Rumor had it that many of the 1,500 men lost had been eaten by sharks. Bartek, for one, was convinced the predators were looking for a chance to turn the men into dinner. Rickenbacker wasn't so sure. He spotted a 6-inch leech of some kind on one of the sharks' heads. He and Whitaker thought that when the sharks bumped the rafts from below, they were simply trying to scrape the parasites off their backs. And yet, no one was willing to jump in and test the theories. When an arm or leg strayed close to the side of a raft, it was hastily yanked back in. As the day brightened, Rickenbacker had the men pull the rafts close. No one mentioned it, but the old war hero had taken charge since they ditched the plane. His arrogance rubbed some of the men the wrong way. They were fiercely loyal to Cherry, and by the rules of the military, the captain of the plane was in charge until the mission was over. But there was something about Rickenbacker that commanded attention. When he spoke, there was no doubt in his voice. To 7 men stranded in the middle of the ocean, certainty was a comforting thing. With the rafts clustered tight, Rickenbacker launched into a pep talk. He was convinced they would be rescued soon. "The planes are probably taking off right now, and that $100 is still up," he said. In the meantime, he warned, they had to conserve energy, move around as little as possible. Don't speak too much. Try to protect themselves from the sun. Most of all, don't drink the seawater, no matter how thirsty they got. Seawater is a lot saltier than the fluids in the human body. Drink it, and the body actually loses liquid trying to flush out the excess salt. The men would dehydrate faster drinking salt water than drinking nothing at all. They had to be disciplined about everything, Rickenbacker said, including food. It had been 24 hours since Rickenbacker, Adamson, Cherry, and Whitaker sat in the cockpit feasting on sweet rolls and coffee. The other men hadn't eaten since before they took off from Hawaii. Captain Cherry dragged out their supplies, and they did the math, simple and grim. 4 oranges, 8 people. Half an orange per person. Rickenbacker proposed that they eat 1 orange every other day, dividing each one evenly 8 ways. Reynolds and DeAngelis grumbled that they hadn't had breakfast the day before like the men in the cockpit. "If we'd known that before we went down, we'd have taken care of you," Rickenbacker replied. "But now it's too late." The protest died away. They'd be rescued before they got to the second orange anyway, wouldn't they? Cherry handed the supplies to Rickenbacker. 7 men watched while the colonel pulled out a sheath knife, bent over an orange, and carved it like a jeweler into 8 precisely equal pieces. Most of the men ate their entire ration, peel and all. Rickenbacker and Cherry thought of another use for the peel. They pulled out the hooks and line that DeAngelis had salvaged from the parachute sacks. Each man baited a hook with a small piece of peel and threw it overboard. They watched while the lines trailed the raft, dangling the bright orange bait in the waves. The peel did not attract a single fish.
Okay, I'm going to stop the recording now because it's going to go over 15 minutes, and I'm going to do a second part. I want you to think about how they survived in the raft, the things that happened, the things that may help them in the future, and the things from their past that actually are going to help them potentially survive.